Welcome to All Things Storybound, a creative outlet where any and all kinds of stories come to life.
From magical to mythical to mortifying, let us take you on a journey you've never experienced before.
Grab your favorite drink and get comfortable. You're in for a wild story ahead. Footsteps in the Dark. Chapter 1. The October air had that familiar crispness, the kind that sent a chill through your bones just before winter fully settled in. Jack adjusted the strap of his worn-out backpack, pulling his jacket tighter around him as he glanced down at Katie. She was skipping a few paces ahead, her bright fairy wings bouncing with every step, casting little glimmers of light in the street lamps that flickered above them.
Look, Dad.
Katie spun on her heels, twirling to show off the glitter on her costume.
I bet I'm the prettiest fairy on the whole street.
Her laughter rang out, bright and infectious, as she waved her wand, a thin plastic thing that sparkled in the dark. She spun around, the wings strapped to her back fluttering with each twirl, completely oblivious to the creeping unease that had settled over Jack like a fog. "Yeah, you sure are, sweetheart," Jack replied, his voice steady but lacking the warmth he wanted to project. He forced a smile, hoping it would cover the tension that had been simmering in his gut all night. The neighborhood streets stretched out before them in familiar quiet, each house nestled under the shadow of ancient oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Halloween decorations dotted the front lawns, grinning pumpkins with flickering candles inside, makeshift graveyards, skeletons half buried in the grass. Most years this sight would have brought him a sense of nostalgia, a sense of peace, but tonight something about it felt off. Jack shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets, trying to shake the feeling. He glanced around. Where were the other trick-or-treaters? In past years, the streets would be filled with children in costumes, parents following along with mugs of coffee, chatting, laughing, but tonight the streets seemed nearly empty. A few porch lights were on here and there, but many houses were dark, as though the families inside had decided to skip the festivities entirely. The ones that were still open for trick-or-treaters seemed half-hearted, with decorations that almost looked abandoned. Something about the quiet was unsettling. Too quiet for Halloween. Katie was already at the next house, bouncing up the porch steps and knocking eagerly on the door. Jack followed more slowly, his eyes lingering on the long stretch of road behind them. The faint rustling of leaves drifted on the wind, the only sound in the still night.
Trick or treat.
Katie's voice called out, full of that innocent excitement only a child could muster. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman in a witch's hat smiled kindly as she dropped candy into Katie's outstretched bag.
My, aren't you a beautiful little fairy?
The woman exclaimed.
You take as much candy as you like, dear. Thank you.
Katie said brightly, stuffing more into her bag. She turned and skipped back towards Jack's, beaming as she waved the loot she'd collected.
Look, Dad, she let me take extras.
Jack smiled, but his attention was still elsewhere. His eyes drifted again to the street behind them. The shadow seemed longer now, more drawn out in the weak streetlights. He squinted into the distance and paused. A figure, just barely at the edge of his vision, standing perfectly still. He blinked, shaking his head. Just a trick of the light, he told himself. It had to be. He'd seen plenty of teenagers out on Halloween before, pulling pranks, lurking in the shadows to scare unsuspecting trick-or-treaters. It was nothing. But as he turned back to Katie, the unease lingered. There was something about the way that figure had stood. Too still, too deliberate. The wind shifted, sending a shiver up Jack's spine.
Dad, come on, there's more houses.
Katie was already darting ahead, her small frame disappearing for a moment into the shadows between streetlights. Jack hurried to catch up with her, keeping his eyes on the ground, trying to shake the feeling. He shouldn't be getting worked up over nothing. It was Halloween, after all, a night of tricks and scares. That's what it was supposed to be about. But there was something different about tonight, something that nagged at him just beneath the surface. The next house was darker than the others, but a carved pumpkin sat on the porch, its grin wide and menacing, the candlelight flickering inside. Katie ran up to the door again, her candy bag bouncing against her side as she knocked on the heavy wooden door. Jack hung back, scanning the street again. The figure was gone now, but his gut told him that it wasn't the end of it. The door remained closed. "Looks like they're not home, sweetheart." Jack said, calling out to Katie as she stood waiting expectantly. He couldn't hide the tension in his voice. Let's head to the next house. Katie pouted but nodded, skipping back down the steps to join him.
Maybe the next place will have full-size candy bars,
she said, her voice still full of hope. Jack tried to focus on her to let her enthusiasm lift him from the creeping anxiety, but it wasn't working. Every time he glanced behind them, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His footsteps felt heavier, dragging along the pavement as they moved from house to house. Another knock, another handful of candy, another glimpse of something in his peripheral vision. It was happening again. Just ahead, past the next streetlight, the figure stood in the shadows once more, barely visible under the yellow haze of the street lamp. Jack stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He squinted, trying to make out the details. Nothing. No costume, no mask, no features at all. Just a dark silhouette standing perfectly still, watching them. Katie tugged on his sleeve, snapping him out of his trance.
Dad, come on, there's more candy.
Yeah, let's keep going, Jack muttered, forcing himself to look away, to keep moving. But his mind was racing now, every muscle in his body tense. What was that figure? A teenager playing a prank? Some other parent? But no one else was out. The further they went, the emptier the streets became. Porch lights flickered off as though people were retreating inside, locking their doors to avoid the night. Jack's grip tightened on Katie's hand as they crossed the street to the next house. His eyes darted nervously between the darkened houses, searching for any sign of life, but the figure was gone again, swallowed by the shadows. They reached the next house, and Jack watched as Katie ran ahead, her fairy wing glinting under the flickering street lamp. His mouth was dry, his pulse quickening. He scanned the street again, but this time he didn't just see shadows. He heard something, a faint rustling behind him, like footsteps crunching on dead leaves. He turned, but the street was empty. Empty except for the lingering cold dread creeping up his spine. He swallowed hard. Just your imagination, he told himself. But deep down, he knew that it wasn't. Chapter 2. The neighborhood felt endless. As Jack and Katie moved from house to house, a sense of isolation pressed down on him. The streets, usually brimming with kids and their families, were eerily deserted now. Jack couldn't stop his eyes from wandering, scanning the dark stretches between streetlights. The wind had picked up, stirring the leaves into soft, unsettling whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach.
Dad, look!
Katie's voice broke the silence, her laughter piercing the tension.
That house has a giant spider!
She pointed excitedly toward a house a few yards away. A massive inflatable spider loomed on the front yard, its legs stretching across the yard, illuminated by flickering orange lights. The house was elaborately decorated, every inch of the lawn covered with plastic gravestones, skeletons, and eerie fog seeping from hidden machines. It was the kind of house kids loved to visit on Halloween, the one that went all out every year. Katie darted ahead, her excitement unbroken by the strange stillness that had settled around them. But Jack's eyes were no longer on her. His gaze lingered on the street behind them. He scanned the shadows again, expecting to see the figure standing there, silent, still, and waiting. Nothing. But that didn't ease the knot in his stomach. He hurried to catch up with Katie as she climbed the porch steps of the spider house.
Trick or treat!
She called out, her voice ringing with a joy that felt at odds with a creeping dread that had burrowed deep into Jack's bones. A middle-aged man dressed in a cheap Dracula costume opened the door and grinned at Katie. "Well, look at you," he said in an exaggerated accent. "A fairy princess. You must be here for some spooky candy." Katie giggled, and the man dropped a handful of candy into her bag.
Thank you,
she said, her voice as bright as ever. But Jack's focus had drifted again. He was scanning the street, still empty, still too quiet. The wind had picked up, howling softly through the trees, making the shadows dance. He turned back towards the house, just in time to see Katie skipping down the porch steps, her wings bouncing with each step.
Let's go to the next one,
she chirped, bounding down the sidewalk ahead of him. Jack opened his mouth to call after her, to tell her to wait, but something stopped him. Footsteps. Not Katie's light, quick steps, but heavier ones. Deliberate. Slow. His heart skipped a beat. He turned around sharply, his eyes searching the darkness. There. The figure was back, standing just behind the last house they'd visited. It stood on the sidewalk, half obscured by a tree, but it was unmistakable. The same tall, shadowy silhouette, still, silent, and far too focused on them. Jack's blood ran cold. His breath quickened as he stared at the figure, hoping, praying that it was just some local kid pulling a prank. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became that this wasn't a prank. The figure didn't move, didn't shift its weight, or turn away like a person would when caught. It just watched. His skin prickled with fear. He turned quickly and hurried to catch up with Katie, who was already skipping towards the next house, unaware of the danger lurking behind them. "Katie, wait up," Jack called, his voice trembling. He tried to keep his tone calm, but it came out more urgent than he intended. Katie stopped and looked back at him, tilting her head curiously.
What's wrong, Dad?
He swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Nothing, sweetie. Just stay close to me, okay?" She nodded, but her smile faltered for a moment, as if she could sense something was off. Jack tried to shake the feeling that something terrible was closing in on them, but every fiber of his being screamed that they were being watched. They approached the next house, and Jack forced himself to look away from the street behind. He didn't want to scare Katie. Not yet. They were probably just being paranoid. Maybe it was one of the older kids messing with them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Katie bounced up the porch steps and knocked on the door, still oblivious to the growing tension in Jack's chest. The door opened, and an elderly woman with frizzy white hair and a witch's hat smiled down at her.
Oh, what a lovely little fairy.
She exclaimed, dropping a handful of candy into Katie's bag.
You be safe out there, okay? It's getting late.
Jack flinched at the words, late. He hadn't realized how long they'd been out. The sky had grown darker, the street lights casting long, eerie shadows over the quiet neighborhood.
Thanks.
Katie said cheerfully, turning to skip back down the steps. Jack barely acknowledged the woman as he hurried to take Katie's hand, his eyes darting nervously around the street. The figure was gone again, but that only made his anxiety worse.
Dad, are you okay?
Katie asked, her voice small, noticing his tension now. Jack forced a smile, though his heart raced. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just let's head home, okay?" Katie frowned, her excitement fading a little.
But we didn't finish all the houses.
Jack's pulse thudded in his ears. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the silence growing louder with every passing second. "I know, sweetheart, but it's getting late, and I think we've got enough candy for tonight." Katie looked disappointed, but she didn't argue. She nodded and tightened her grip on his hand as they turned towards home. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they walked, the quiet of the neighborhood suffocating. Every sound, the wind rustling the leaves, the faint creak of a door closing somewhere in the distance, felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath. As they passed under a flickering streetlight, Jack couldn't resist glancing over his shoulder again. His stomach dropped. The figure was back, closer now. It was standing just a few houses away, half hidden by a hedge, but unmistakably there. Jack's breath quickened. He could feel the weight of its gaze on him. Even from this distance, he turned away quickly, pulling Katie along faster. "Come on, Katie, let's get home." They hurried down the street, but Jack's mind was racing. Whoever or whatever was following them wasn't just some prankster. He knew that now. The way the figure moved, or didn't move, made his skin crawl. Every time they reached a new house, it was there again, closer than before, watching them from the shadows. Jack's hands trembled as they turned onto their street. They were almost home now, just a few more blocks. His legs felt heavy, his breath shallow as the weight of the night bore down on them. The figure was following them. He was sure of it now, and it was getting closer. Chapter 3. They turned the corner onto their street, and their house came into view at the far end of the block, dark and shadowy under the dim glow of the street lamps. Relief flooded through Jack's veins, but it was tainted with fear. The distance between them and safety felt insurmountable, like they were trudging through molasses while someone was closing in on them, unseen but relentless. Katie clutched his hand tighter, her small fingers cold against his skin. Her energy had shifted. Gone was the carefree excitement of a night of trick-or-treating. She sensed it now, too, the strange, suffocating feeling that had followed them from house to house. Jack could feel her slowing down, her earlier exuberance replaced with caution.
Dad, why are we going so fast?
Katie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack tried to force a reassuring smile, but his lips felt stiff, his face frozen in fear. "We're almost home, honey," he said, quickening his pace as they walked. "Just keep moving, okay?" Katie glanced behind them, and Jack immediately tensed. He didn't want her to see, didn't want her to know what had been trailing them all night. But when she turned back to him, there was no fear in her eyes, only confusion.
Is someone following us?
She asked innocently, her eyes wide. Jack's throat tightened. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to lie, but didn't want to scare her either. "No," he said, though his voice trembled. Just keep close." They hurried along the street, Jack's heart pounding with every step. He could feel it now, the presence behind them, like a cold shadow creeping closer, unseen but inescapable. His skin prickled, his breath shallow as the weight of the night pressed down on him. The figure had vanished from his sight again. A cold gust of wind swept through the neighborhood, rustling the dry leaves that littered the street. The sound was deafening in the stillness, like whispers in the dark, like something moving just out of reach. Jack fought the urge to look back again, to confront whatever it was that was following them. But he knew better. Looking wouldn't make it go away. It would only make it worse. They were almost there, just a few more houses. But with every step they took, Jack's fear mounted. The closer they got to home, the more certain he became that something terrible was waiting for them. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't even put it into words. But the feeling was undeniable. The figure wasn't just following them. It was leading them. He stole a glance over his shoulder, his heart racing. There it was, standing at the corner, just a few houses back, still as a statue. Jack's stomach lurched. It was closer now, closer than it had ever been. The figure stood under the faint glow of a streetlight, its form indistinct, a shadowy silhouette without any features, without any face, just a tall lumen presence that radiated malice. It wasn't moving, but it was watching, always watching. Jack's breath quickened, panic surging through him. He pulled Katie along faster, almost dragging her now. "Come on, Katie. We have to hurry." She stumbled slightly, her wings catching on the breeze as she tried to keep up.
Dad, what's wrong?
She asked, her voice small and scared now. "Nothing. We're almost there," Jack muttered, though the word felt like a lie, even to his own ears. His pulse pounded in his temples, the blood rushing through the body like a tidal wave. His eyes darted between the houses, searching for any sign of life, any other parents, any other children, but the street was deserted. The entire neighborhood seemed to have fallen into an eerie, unnatural silence, as though the world had slipped into some kind of waking nightmare. They reached their driveway, and Jack fumbled for his keys, his fingers trembling. His breath came in short, panic bursts as he tried to force himself to stay calm. The figure was closer now, he could feel it, even though he hadn't turned around to check. It was standing just at the edge of the yard, its silent gaze boring into the back of Jack's soul. Come on," Jack muttered under his breath, struggling to fit the key into the lock. His hands were shaking so badly that the key slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground.
Dad!
Katie cried, clutching his jacket, her small body pressed against his leg as she looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Jack cursed under his breath and scooped up the keys, his fingers icy and numb. His heart was racing now, pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. The sound of his own blood roared in his ears, blocking out everything else. Finally, he jammed the key into the lock and twisted it violently. The door creaked open, and Jack all but shoved Katie inside, slamming the door behind them with a force that rattled the windows. He locked the door, both deadbolt and chain, and stood there for a moment, leaning against it, his body shaking with adrenaline. They were inside, safe, but the fear didn't leave him. The house was dark and cold, the silence oppressive. Jack flicked on the hallway light, but the dull yellow glow did nothing to chase away the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he leaned against the door, listening, waiting. The doorknob rattled. Jack froze, his heart stopping for a brief, terrible moment. The sound was unmistakable. The doorknob twisted again, a soft, deliberate click, like someone trying to force their way inside. Jack's blood turned to ice. He grabbed the handle and twisted the deadbolt again, double-checking it. His fingers trembled as he pressed his ear to the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no sound at all. Jack backed away from the door, his breath shaky, his mind racing. He turned to Katie, who stood in the hallway, her candy bag clutched tightly in her hands, her wings sagging slightly. She looked so small in the dim light, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear.
Dad, is someone outside?
She whispered. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. No, he said, though his voice was barely audible. No one's there. But as the words left his mouth, the sound of footsteps inside the house sent a jolt of terror through him. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Jack's pulse skyrocketed, his breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the hallway leading to the back of the house. The footsteps were coming from somewhere deeper inside, somewhere they hadn't been yet. His mind raced. He had locked the front door, checked it twice. The house had been empty when they left. No one could have gotten in. No one was inside, but the footsteps were unmistakable. Stay here, Jack whispered to Katie, though his voice was barely more than a hoarse croak. He picked up the heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter, gripping it tightly, as though it could protect him from whatever was lurking in the shadows. Katie's eyes filled with fear.
No, Dad, don't go. Stay with me.
Jack knelt down, trying to force a reassuring smile, but his face felt stiff, his fear impossible to mask. I'll just be a second. Stay here, okay? Don't move. Katie whimpered but nodded, clutching her candy bag like it was a lifeline. Jack stood up and edged down the hallway, his hands shaking as he raised the flashlight. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door at the end of the hall. The sound of footsteps growing louder with every step. He flicked the flashlight on, its harsh beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They echoed all around him now, like they were moving through the walls, coming from every direction but from nowhere he could see. A chill ran down his spine. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. This isn't real, he told himself. This can't be happening. But the sound of footsteps, deliberate, heavy, and impossible, filled the house, closing in on him. Jack backed away, his chest tightening with terror as the world seemed to shrink around him. He had to get back to Katie, had to protect her. But when he turned back toward the front door, his stomach twisted with a sickening jolt of horror. Katie was gone. Chapter 4. Jack's mind went blank for a moment. The hallway had stretched out before him, long and impossibly still, its shadows twisted by the dim light of the overhead bulb. The front door was right there, but Katie wasn't. The space where she'd been standing, clutching her candy bag, was now just an empty spot on the floor. Katie! Jack shouted, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. He turned in circles, scanning the room as if she could have hidden herself somewhere in plain sight. Katie! The house was filled with silence. The footsteps that had plagued him moments ago had stopped, leaving nothing but a hollow, suffocating quiet in their wake. Jack's breath came in shallow bursts, his pulse pounding so loudly in his ears he could barely hear anything else. He stumbled through the house, frantically searching for his daughter. Katie! He shouted again, his voice breaking. Katie, where are you? There was no answer. Jack ran to the front door, yanking it open and stepping onto the porch. The cold night air hitting him like a slap in the face. He scanned the dark street, his eyes wild, searching the shadows for any sign of her. The wind rustled the leaves, the streetlights flickered, but there was nothing. No figure in the distance, no flash of Katie's fairy wings. It was as if she had vanished. He backed into the house, slamming the door shut once more, his breathing erratic, his mind raced. This can't be happening. She couldn't just disappear like that. She was right there just a moment ago, right in front of him. How could she be gone? Katie, please! Jack's voice cracked, his desperation rising with every second of silence that passed. He rushed from room to room, flinging open doors, turning on lights, searching every corner of the house. Each empty room he encountered made his stomach twist further into knots, a sickening feeling of dread settling in his gut. He checked every bedroom, every closet, every place she could have hidden, but the house was empty. His daughter, his sweet little Katie, was gone. Jack collapsed onto the floor of the hallway, his back pressed against the wall, gasping for breath. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, the weight of his fear and confusion crashing over him in waves. He tried to think, tried to piece together what had happened, but his mind was clouded with panic. How could she just vanish? She was right there, right in front of him. He'd held her hand, he'd watched her run from house to house, gathering candy in her fairy costume. He could still hear her laughter in his ears, the way she'd call him Dad with that playful smile of hers. but now the house was dead silent. Jack buried his face in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp as his thoughts spiraled. His heart raced, his breathing quick and shallow as he rocked back and forth, desperately trying to make sense of it all. She can't be gone. She can't be. His mind flickered back to the beginning of the night, to when they had first set out for trick-or-treating. He remembered her running ahead of him, her fairy wings bouncing in the glow of the streetlights. He remembered the houses, the candy, the laughter, but now the memories felt hazy, distant, like they belonged to someone else. The more he tried to focus on them, the more they slipped away, faded into the background of his mind. Little details, her smile, her voice, the way she held his hand, started to feel less real, less solid. Jack clenched his fists, trying to hold on to the memories, but the harder he tried, the more they blurred. And then slowly, a terrible thought began to form in the back of his mind. Katie hadn't been real. A cold, creeping dread curled in Jack's stomach as the thought took hold, refusing to be dismissed. He shook his head, pushing it away. No, that can't be true. He remembered her. He remembered holding her hand, taking her from house to house. He remembered, but then he didn't. Their memories were wrong, muddled. They didn't fit together like they should. There was no coherent string, no order to him. It was as if his brain had taken pieces of a dream and tried to stitch them into reality. He tried to think of the last time he'd seen her, truly seen her. Not tonight, but before that. Last week, last month, his mind came up blank. Jack stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. The walls of the house seemed to close in, the dim light casting eerie shadows across the floor. His breath was shallow, his heart racing as they stumbled down the hallway. The truth hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. Katie hadn't been there at all. She wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. She hadn't been by his side all night, hadn't run from house to house, hadn't held his hand. He had been alone the entire time. His body felt numb as the realization settled in. The figure that had followed him, the footsteps that echoed through him, it had never been anyone else. The entire time it had been him, his own mind chasing him with a ghost he couldn't let go of. Jack's knees gave out and he collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his grief crushed him. The memories that had sustained them, that had kept him sane, they had all been lies. Katie was gone. She had been gone for years. Jack's hands shook as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at the home screen, at the photo of Katie smiling back at him, her face bright with joy. The photo was from 2 years ago, taken before the accident, before everything had fallen apart. He had lost her then, not tonight, not to some dark figure lurking in the shadows, but to a tragic accident. One that left him hollow, lost, and unable to accept the truth. He had created her tonight, an illusion, a fragment of his broken mind, because he couldn't let go. The truth was too painful. Jack dropped the phone, letting it clatter onto the floor as he curled into himself, sobbing. His mind raced, trying to cling to the last shreds of the fantasy he had built for himself. But it was no use. The walls were crumbling, the illusion had shattered. There was no Katie. There never had been. Not tonight. He was alone.